It feels like, for some reason, video game movies have been getting a lot more popular in the past few years. With films like Tomb Raider, Sonic the Hedgehog, or even Uncharted, which is supposed to come out this year. And I don't know why. Video game movies first became a thing in the 90s with Super Mario Bros., which was the first one, as well as other movies like Street Fighter or Double Dragon. That was a good way for Hollywood to make movies on popular franchises, and since they were only made for the money, those films ranked from not really good to mediocre. In the 2000s, these films became less and less common and more mediocre, mostly thanks to Uwe Boll. He's the one who made terrible films like Postal, Alone in the Dark, or House of the Dead, and I believe that these films were much worse. But we also got other really bad films like Max Payne with Mark Wahlberg, the Resident Evil film series, or Doom with Dwayne Johnson The Rock, which I respect a tiny bit more than the other ones because it had the idea of making a first-person scene. It feels really weird in the film because it doesn't fit at all with the rest of the movie, but I appreciate that they tried to make an interesting scene. So, as you guys can see, these films were wet garbage, and they also became less and less popular over the years. This led to a lot of people thinking that video game movies were just gonna die. Until a few years ago. For some reason, Hollywood started making more video game movies out of nowhere, with films like Agent 47, Warcraft, Assassin's Creed, or the new Tomb Raider film. Even though those films got terrible reviews, Hollywood seemed to give them much bigger budgets than before, and they also made a lot more money than before. I mean, Sonic the Hedgehog is one of the highest grossing films of 2020. Would this have happened without the pandemic? I don't think so. But that still says a lot. And with more films being made like Uncharted or Monster Hunter, a lot of people are wondering what's gonna come next. What's the next game that's gonna be adapted? And of course, everyone's wondering if their favorite game is gonna get adapted. And out of every game possible, I feel like one game comes out a tiny bit more than the other ones. The Legend of Zelda. And as a big Zelda fan myself, I thought that this is a terrible idea. Why would we let Hollywood destroy our favorite game franchise? But as I thought about it a little bit more, I thought, well, it's not impossible to make a bad Zelda film. So, producers of Hollywood, let me explain to you how you should make a good Zelda film. Before I properly get into the subject, I thought it would be important to ask why. Why should Hollywood make a Zelda movie? What I would like to say first is that even though video game movies seem to be having a boost in popularity, I can't find a single video game movie with good ratings. On most movie rating sites like Rotten Tomato, IMDb, or Letterboxd, the highest video game film is generally Sonic the Hedgehog, but even there, the film has very mixed reviews. Some people like the film because of the memes or Jim Carrey as Dr. Robotnik. But a lot of people don't like it because it's got a very bland road trip story, a lot of the jokes aren't that good, and the cast is weak. I think it would be nice to finally have a video game film that is critically acclaimed, showing Hollywood that they don't always need to make bad movies to make money. Obviously, I don't think Zelda is the only game that could make a good film. I can also think of Death Stranding, GTA, The Last of Us, or even games that have already been adapted like Tomb Raider or Assassin's Creed. The only reason why I chose Zelda is because it's the game series that I'm the most familiar with. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into it. The Legend of Zelda is a very big franchise with over 20 games in the main series. Each of these games have a different story, a different Link, a different Zelda, and a different antagonist. So there definitely are many options to choose from. I thought that since a lot of people are probably gonna watch the film without knowing that much stuff about Zelda, the film should be a good introduction to the Zelda franchise, so I'll choose the game mostly based on that. One of the most obvious choices is Ocarina of Time. It's probably the most popular Zelda game and also the highest rated. Many people first think of Ocarina of Time when they think about Zelda. The story is also great for a movie because the game already does a very good introduction of the world of Hyrule. Just take the first cutscene of the first game. It doesn't have just a lot of text like many other Zelda games with all that ancestor bullshit. It just explains what the Kokiri Forest is and what life is like there, as well as teasing you about the scene before Link becomes an adult. In just a few seconds, it explains everything you need to know to understand the story and makes you interested in what that scene is gonna be. The story is also very basic. In a lot of cases, this could be a flaw, but not here. I feel like a lot of Zelda game stories are mostly based on a gimmick that is only there for one game and that is never mentioned again. For example, the Twilight World in Twilight Princess or the sea in Wind Waker. Ocarina of Time doesn't have any of that. Sure, it has the ocarina, but the idea of using music to solve puzzles is reused many other times in the saga. Plus, Ocarina of Time wasn't even the first game to have an ocarina, since it was also used in Link to the Past. In terms of character, you have the usual Link, Zelda, and Ganondorf trio. I don't think they should pick a game with, let's say, Vaati, because he's only in a handful of games while Ganondorf is the main villain. I mean, is Vaati in Smash? Yeah, that's what I thought. I also think it's a good idea to have Ganondorf as the villain and not just Ganon. Ganondorf is a very charismatic villain. He was trusted by the loyal family and betrayed them to acquire the Triforce. Meanwhile, Ganon is just a pig. You also have the most common species in Zelda, the Hylians, the Zoras, the Gorons, and the Gerudo. I think it's important to have them since they're a pretty big part of the Zelda universe. It could also be important to dive into how the Gyarados feel with Ganondorf being such a bad guy. But making an Ocarina of Time movie would also mean that they should make the movie at least PG. Because I'm sorry, but if you want a good representation of the Shadow Temple and the well, you have to make it at least PG. Call me weird if you want, but I need that hand in the film. Which is also why the film should be directed by David Cronenberg. And if this Ocarina of Time movie is popular enough, this means that we could probably get a sequel, and getting an Ocarina of Time sequel means getting a movie about Majora's Mask, which could either be the worst film in the world or the most fantastic film you've ever seen in your life. So that's a lot of good things, but I definitely changed some things about the story so it could be a better film. First of all, I try to find a way to make the dungeons more interesting. They are a massive portion of the game, but the thing is that nothing really happens in them in terms of story. It's just Link walking through the dungeons, fighting enemies until he gets to the end. I think we would need to cut some of them out of the story. I'm sorry, but there's too many. It's also obvious that they couldn't put an entire dungeon in the film since they're too big. Every dungeon is gonna have to be shortened. I also think that the dungeon should have a bigger objective than just finding the medallion. For example, Jabu Jabu's belly was also a rescue mission to save Princess Ruto. I also know that I want Ganondorf's clone to be a much more important part of the Forest Temple. I think this idea is very interesting, and it absolutely deserves to be more than a fight. Another thing I'd like to change is the Shadow Temple, especially everything related to the Sheikah civilization. I think the Sheikah story is incredibly interesting, and I would love it if the movie could go more in depth about their story. Because from what I understand, the Shadow Temple was basically used to torture them during their genocide. That's really interesting. So, as I just explained, I think that Ocarina of Time would probably be the best game to adapt into a movie, but it definitely isn't the only one. Another good choice would be Skyward Sword, and I know this game is one of the most hated in the entire franchise, and even though I have to agree that there's a lot of bad stuff in it, pretty much everything bad in this game is related to the game part of it. The repetitive bosses, the uninteresting temples, fire not shutting up about your controller's battery, those are all issues that you won't find in a film. But the story is pretty good. It's also the first game in the timeline, and even though it's been established that the timeline doesn't make any sense since Breath of the Wild, Skyward Sword would still be a good introduction to Zelda. But the problem I have with choosing Skyward Sword is that I'm breaking a rule that I established earlier. I mentioned that I wouldn't pick Wind Waker or Twilight Princess because the story of these games are based on a gimmick that never comes back in any other game. And having a city in the sky definitely fits as one of those gimmicks. I think it would be nice to have scenes where Link flies on his bird, but that's still a gimmick. It's basically like Wind Waker, except they replaced the sea with the sky. But there's definitely some interesting stuff about Skyward Sword that would be interesting to put in a film. The best example being Zelda. In a lot of games, she's barely even a secondary character and often just ends up being a cold bitch because she has little to no personality. Meanwhile, the Zelda in Skyward Sword is nice and lovable, which in my opinion makes you care a lot more about her. And obviously her relationship with Link is fantastic. Although that doesn't mean that the film Zelda should necessarily be nice and lovable. We could also make her the opposite while still making her personality interesting, like the Zelda in Breath of the Wild. Speaking of which, the last game that I think could fit as a movie is Breath of the Wild, and for a few reasons. First of all, it's the most recent. I know this video is more about the artistic side of the movie industry, but in terms of business, it would be a really good idea for Nintendo to make a Breath of the Wild movie. Another good part is that this game doesn't really have any gimmick. I mean, obviously this game's gameplay isn't at all like the other games, but that's just for the gameplay. In terms of story, everything is pretty similar. Obviously the temples have been replaced with the Sanctuary and Divine Beast, but they're pretty similar. Also, while we're at it, I think we should delete the Sanctuaries. I'm sorry, but there are way too many of them, and their only purpose is gameplay related. It just wouldn't make sense to put them in the film. To me, the best part about making a Breath of the Wild movie is that it's filled with flashbacks. I think it would be interesting to make the film more about Link trying to regain his memory after waking up, either in flashbacks that randomly come up to him, or in stories told by the people that he meets on his journey. And as I mentioned earlier, Breath of the Wild Zelda is a very good character for a movie. But if there's one thing that I'd change from the game, it's Ganondorf. I don't think he's a good villain for a movie. Mainly because he's not even there for most of the game, and when they describe him, he's described more like an entity than a living creature. That could totally be an interesting villain, but I feel like it wouldn't be representative to the kind of villain that Ganondorf is. Alright, so here we have 3 Zelda games that could potentially become a movie. And you might be wondering, well, which one am I gonna choose? And the answer is none of them. Because after a lot of thinking, I believe that the Zelda movie should be an original story. The Legend of Zelda has a lot of games. Every game has basically the same formula. You play as Link, who's on an adventure to save Zelda or even the entire world from the bad guy. Obviously, not every Zelda game has this exact story, but that's what you expect from a typical Zelda game. Besides, the games that don't use this formula are considered as apart from the rest of the franchise. But even with this formula, every single Zelda game feels like a completely different experience for many different reasons. I already mentioned how a lot of them have a gimmick, either in the gameplay or the story, that makes the game stand out. Honestly, the only game that doesn't have some kind of gimmick is The Legend of Zelda on NES because it didn't need it. It was the first one. What I'm trying to say is that every single Zelda game is unique, a completely different experience from what the fans are used to in Zelda. And I believe that the Zelda movie shouldn't just be considered as an adaptation of a video game franchise to cinema. It should be considered as a new entry to the franchise. So for this video, I wrote the story about what I think the Zelda movie should be. I didn't write a full script because obviously that would take way too long and it probably would be pretty bad. Instead, what I did is that I wrote kind of an abridged story of the Zelda movie. So without further ado, here is what I think should be the Legend of Zelda movie. The movie starts with Link waking up. Some people might think that it's a cliche and that it's not original. I agree. The thing is that pretty much every single Zelda game since A Link to the Past starts with Link waking up. At this point, it's basically a tradition. The first part of the film is gonna show Link living in his house with his uncle, like in Link to the Past. The reason why I chose that is because I thought it would be interesting to give Link a family. It doesn't have to be his uncle, it could be his sister or his grandmother. I want the film to show at least one day in Link's life before his adventure begins. I imagine him as just a normal teenager around 17 to 18 years old who lives a normal life. Although it's shown that he really likes to fight and hopes to one day work as a knight for Hyrule Castle. His favorite hobby is running in the woods fighting small enemies like bats and choo-choos. This part is where we're gonna introduce the world of Hyrule as well as Link's personality to the audience. Next, we see Link walking in the forest. He fights an enemy or two until he hears a noise. It sounds like a mix of people screaming and fighting. He decides to go in that direction to see if he can help. He ends up getting to Hyrule Castle and sees a lot of soldiers fighting against an army of monsters led by an evil looking man. He looks at the fight until he notices a young girl going into the forest. Link decides to follow her so he can help her. Once he finally gets to her, he sees that she's being attacked by a bokoblin. Link decides to help her and fight it. Unfortunately, he gets beaten up and passes out. He ends up waking up in the forest during nighttime and he quickly realizes that next to him, there's a tree talking to him. Obviously, it's the Deku tree and he basically explains the whole situation to Link. Basically, Ganondorf, who is known for being the man that brought chaos and fear to Hyrule, was known to be trapped in the Hyrule Castle for centuries. He was trapped by 3 sages that put a spell on him. The problem is that he was finally able to escape and he captured the sages in different places of Hyrule. Link has to go where the sages are trapped and free them. The first location is in Death Mountain where he meets the Gorons. They already know that Ganondorf is back, so they help Link find the first sage, which is trapped in a cavern. I won't go into as many details, but this is basically the equivalent of a dungeon. Instead of having a full dungeon like in the games, I was thinking more about a fight with a famous Zelda enemy like Goma, or maybe another boss that would be more fitting with the Gorons. Once he's able to free the first sage, he goes to the next location, Lake Hylia. However, once Link gets there, he doesn't get the same welcome that he got from the Gorons. The Zoras have already been attacked by Ganondorf's army, so the whole lake is filled with enemies. Link manages to find a few Zoras that tell him where the sage is trapped. He gets there and instead of having to fight someone, he has to solve a puzzle. Link manages to solve it and free the second sage. There's only one last sage left and it's in Gerudo Valley. He gets there and meets the Gerudos. Unlike the Zoras and the Gorons, they don't think Link can fight Ganondorf. They think it's impossible for someone this young and inexperienced to do such a task. They still show him where the sage is trapped, thinking that he's gonna get himself killed. In order to free the sage, Link has to fight a famous Zelda enemy, Dark Link. Again, I'm not gonna go into a lot of details, but against what the Gyarados thought, Link beats Dark Link and manages to free the third sage. Once he gets the 3 sages, Link goes back to the Deku tree. The tree tells Link to go through a dark path in the forest. This path leads to an old sword on a pedestal. Link grabs the sword, pulls it from the ground, and becomes the wielder of the Master Sword. This is now the moment for Link to go to Hyrule Castle and defeat Ganondorf. He gets to the castle, beats some enemies until he gets to the throne room, where Ganondorf is waiting for Link. When Link enters the room, Ganondorf is sitting on the throne. Zelda is sitting next to him, but she's attached there. Link and Ganondorf talk for a little bit, the classic hero to villain talk. Link says he's gonna beat Ganondorf and Ganondorf just treats him like he's a kid. Ganondorf tosses Zelda to the side of the room, gets up, and takes out a giant sword. The battle begins. I won't go into too many details about the battle because there isn't much to say. They fight for a little bit until Ganondorf becomes really weak. That's when he uses his last tool and turns it to Ganon. Because in most games with Ganondorf as a villain, he ends up transforming into Ganon. Link suddenly struggles a lot more to defeat Ganondorf, so the sages come and help him. The 4 of them use their forces to defeat and trap Ganondorf. And just like that, Link has defeated Ganondorf. Zelda goes back to the throne, Ganondorf stays trapped, and Link becomes a knight for the Hyrule Castle, just like he dreamed about. And that's how the movie ends. Obviously, this isn't really detailed and you could probably find a bunch of plot holes, but as I explained earlier, this isn't a full script. It's just to give you guys an idea of what I'd want the movie to be about. And I think that if this was the story for the Zelda movie, it wouldn't make the fans mad. There's a few references from other Zelda games, it shows the main characters in the Zelda franchise. It's far from being perfect, but I think it's a good base at least. So now we have a story, but we also need people to bring it to life because, I'd love to direct the film, but I don't think that hiring an 18-year-old who has no experience in movie making would be the best idea. So in order to find a good director, we need someone who has experience in directed fantasy films. If possible, an adaptation of a popular franchise that has a lot of lore. We also need someone who can direct a big film with a lot of special effects. Honestly, I really didn't have to think a lot about this one. I think the best person to direct this film would be Peter Jackson. Obviously, there are a lot of differences between Zelda and Lord of the Rings, but at the end of the day, they both are big fantasy franchises, and I believe that they both require the same skills for a director. Now that we have a director, we need to find a cast. I'd like to find the actors to play Link, Zelda, Ganondorf, the Deku Tree, and the Three Sages. First, let's start with our main character, Link. I want him to be around 17 to 18 years old, so we need an actor that could look that age. And I found two successful and talented actors that I think look similar enough to Link to make it work. The first one is Timothée Chalamet, an actor that you might know from films like Call Me By Your Name or Denis Villeneuve's upcoming adaptation of Dune. I know some people might think that he doesn't look enough like Link, but honestly, I think that with blonde hair, it could totally work. The second actor I thought of is Cole Sprouse, who you might know from shows like Riverdale or The Suite Life of Zack and Cody. Same thing, I think that if you dye his hair blonde, it could work. Next, we need a Zelda, and just like Link, I chose two actresses. The first one is Saoirse Ronan, who you might know from films like Little Woman or Lady Bird. For the appearance, I think that if you give her a princess dress, it could totally work. For her acting, I've seen a lot more of her abilities than the other actors, and I think she could give a really good performance. The other actress is Chloe Grace Moretz, who you might know from Kick-Ass. Again, I think the appearance would work really well, and I also think that she could give a great performance. Especially after her role in Kick-Ass, I think she could make a great badass Zelda. So here we have two options for Link and Zelda. Now we need a villain. For Ganondorf, the first actor I thought of is Idris Elba. He has a kind of classy side that I think could really work well for Ganondorf. And I mean, I don't think we could go wrong by choosing the guy who played Macavity in Cats. I've never seen him play a villain, but I believe that he has the charisma needed to play a great one. And here we have our three main characters, Triforce of Courage, Strength, and Wisdom. Now let's get into the minor characters. The first one is the Deku Tree. What's nice about him is that he's probably gonna be done with CGI or something. So we don't need to cast someone based on appearance. All we need is a good voice. We need someone who can sound old and wise, but also caring. And what better voice to sound wise and caring than Mufasa himself, James Earl Jones. I think it's fair to say that he has one of the best voices in Hollywood, and I believe that it would be a perfect fit for the Deku Tree. And finally, we need three actors to play the sages. They need to be somewhat old and wise, but they also have to seem nice so that the public want them to be saved. The first actor I chose is Danny DeVito because I don't know about you guys, but I'm always happy to see him on screen. He also has a look that I think would fit a lot of people's description of a sage. The second person I chose is Maggie Smith. She's the kind of person that I think a lot of people would want as a grandma. And any Harry Potter fan would agree that she fits the description of a sage. I'm also a little bit biased because I'm such a fan of her performance in Harry Potter. Finally, the final sage I chose is John Lithgow, who you might know from a bunch of films but who I discovered in How I Met Your Mother. Same thing than the other sages. I think he perfectly fits the description of a sage, and I believe that he would give a great performance. So here we have our cast. Obviously, every single actor could be replaced by other actors. I'm sure some people are gonna think that this cast is a bit unrealistic for a Zelda movie because there are too many big names in Hollywood, and that realistically we should probably take some more unknown actors, and I agree. But the thing is that, I have full control over the cast, so obviously I'm gonna take the actors that I want to see on screen. So that was a basic explanation on what I think should be the Legend of Zelda movie, and obviously that's just one way to make it. There are so many Zelda stories that would make a really good film, whether it's an adaptation or an original story. And I also think that there are a lot of things that could be changed about my story. But that's just an idea of what a story written by someone who has never written a screenplay before would look like. There are also a lot of things that I mentioned at the beginning of the video that I didn't get to talk about in my story. The best example being the Sheikahs. The thing is that in order to talk about the Sheikahs the way that I wanted to, we need to make an entire movie about that. Also, since the beginning of the video, I've been talking about a Zelda film. I never mentioned the idea of a Zelda TV show, which could totally exist. With shows like Game of Thrones or The Witcher, we know that it's possible to make a good show in a fantasy universe. If they could do it for The Witcher, they could do it for Zelda. Making a Zelda show would actually be a pretty good idea because in that way, we could add a lot more characters, especially characters that are important to the Zelda franchise, like Impa or Tingle. And obviously, we could talk about a lot more aspects of the world of Hyrule, like the Sheikahs, as I mentioned earlier, or even just the way that the other species live and their relationship with the world of Hyrule. There's a crazy amount of possibilities with Zelda. It's such a big franchise that we could make 1,000 films based on it with a lot of different stories. But I don't have the time to talk about all of that in only one YouTube video, so I'll stop here for today. Thank you very much for watching my video. If you liked it, you can like it, comment it, subscribe to my channel, which is basically what every single YouTuber on earth tells you to do. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram, as well as my other YouTube channel where I make music. The links are gonna be in the description. Thanks again for watching my video, and I'll see you soon.